When we think about ancient Greece, we usually picture Athens, Sparta, maybe Corinth. But some of the most important ideas in Greek civilization didn't come from mainland Greece at all. They came from the eastern edge of the Greek world, from the coast of Anatolia, in a region known as Ionia. This is where Greeks first began asking why the world works the way it does, where philosophy, science, and historical inquiry begin to separate from myth, and where Greek culture became deeply international, shaped by contact with Anatolia, the Near East, and beyond. But the Ionians didn't start out as great thinkers. They were migrants, refugees in many cases, and their story begins with collapse. First, how the Ionians came to Anatolia. Around 1200 BCE, the eastern Mediterranean enters a period of crisis known as the Late Bronze Age collapse. Mycenaean palace societies in mainland Greece fall apart. Trade networks break down. Population movements follow. This is the backdrop for what Greek tradition later remembered as migrations, including the movement of peoples we call Ionians, Aeolians, and Dorians. According to later Greek memory, especially preserved by writers like Herodotus, the arrival of Dorian groups into southern Greece disrupted older Mycenaean populations. Whether this was a violent invasion or a slower social transformation is debated, but the effect is clear. Many Greek-speaking communities moved eastward, across the Aegean, toward the Anatolian coast. Among them were the people who would later be called Ionian Greeks. They settled along the central western coast of Anatolia, as well as nearby islands like Chios and Samos. This region had been heavily urbanized for centuries under Hittite and Anatolian cultures, so the Ionians were not settling empty land. They were inserting themselves into an already complex world. Importantly, the Ionians did not arrive as a single organized group. They arrived city by city, family by family, over generations. Second, from settlements to city-states. Between roughly 1050 and 900 BCE, these settlements solidify into independent city-states. Major Ionian cities include Miletus, Ephesus, Smyrna, Chios, and Samos. Each city had its own laws, leaders, and interests. There was no Ionian kingdom, no federal state, no capital. But, and this is important, the Ionians were not isolated from one another. They shared the Ionic Greek dialect, common religious practices, and a growing sense of shared identity. This identity expressed itself most clearly in a religious political league centered on a sanctuary known as the Panionion, dedicated to Poseidon. This was not a government in the modern sense. No standing army, no taxation system, no unified foreign policy. The Ionians remained city-states, but they were interconnected more so than many other Greek groups. Third, the sea becomes their world. Geography shaped everything. Ionia was a narrow strip of land between the Anatolian interior and the Aegean Sea. There was no vast agricultural hinterland to depend on. Growth meant movement, and movement meant ships. From early on, Ionian life revolved around the sea. Ships left their harbors not as rare expeditions, but as routine traffic, linking Ionian cities to Egypt, the Levant, and the wider eastern Mediterranean. What returned was essential for city life: food, raw materials, and steady contact with distant regions, tying Ionia into networks far larger than Greece itself. This outward orientation went further than trade. By around 800 BCE, Ionian cities, especially Miletus, pushed beyond the Aegean and founded permanent settlements around the Black Sea. These were not temporary outposts, but full cities, built to last and deeply integrated into their local environments. Through these routes and colonies, Ionians encountered unfamiliar ways of organizing time, space, and knowledge. Over generations, this produced a culture unusually comfortable with distance, diversity, and connection. Before Ionian thinkers began asking how nature worked, Ionian sailors had already learned that the world was wide. Fourth, writing, literacy, and a new mental world around 800 BCE, Ionian cities were part of a quiet but transformative change. Like other Greeks, they adapted the Phoenician script, but with a crucial difference. They added vowels, creating a writing system that could capture spoken Greek with unusual precision. This mattered because writing in Ionia quickly moved beyond simple labels or trademarks. It began to record speech, argument, and memory. The clearest reflection of this world is the epic tradition later associated with Homer. Composed in Ionic Greek, the Iliad and the Odyssey are not just heroic tales. They focus on people under pressure, where honor, anger, and loyalty collide. Even when the gods appear, the story turns on human choice rather than divine command. Alongside epic poetry, writing entered everyday civic life. Laws were written down and displayed. Agreements could be preserved beyond memory. Knowledge no longer depended entirely on who was present in the room. The result was subtle but profound. When words can be fixed, people begin to analyze them. When arguments can be preserved, they can be challenged. Writing didn't create philosophy, but it made it possible to lay ideas out step by step. That habit of mind would soon be turned toward nature itself. 5. The birth of Greek philosophy. Between about 700 to 550 BCE, Ionian cities were at their strongest, wealthy, active, and confident enough to question how the world worked. This was not just an economic high point. It was an intellectual one. In cities like Miletus, thinkers began to ask questions that would have sounded strange elsewhere in Greece. Instead of asking which god caused a flood or an eclipse, they asked what underlying process produced it and whether that process could be understood. Thales believed the natural world followed one set of rules, not many unrelated ones. He tried to explain things using physical causes instead of myths, arguing that everything came from water, and he used the same logical thinking in mathematics and geometry. What mattered most was the shift toward explaining the world through reason rather than sacred stories. His student, Anaximander, went even further. He suggested that the world did not come from a familiar element like water or earth, but from something unlimited and undefined. He argued that nature followed its own rules, keeping itself in balance over time. He also described the earth as floating freely in space, without being held up by gods or mythical supports, and he even hinted that living creatures had changed over long periods in response to their surroundings. Another Milesian thinker, Anaximenes, tried to explain change in nature using simple processes people could observe. He argued that things transform as air becomes thicker or thinner, what we might call compression and expansion, and that these visible processes could explain how the world changes without turning to myth. Outside Miletus, Ionian inquiry took other forms. Heraclitus argued that the world was always changing and never truly at rest. He believed that stability was an illusion and that tension and conflict were basic forces shaping reality rather than problems to be solved. What unites these thinkers is not agreement. They disagreed sharply. What unites them is the assumption that the world could be questioned, that explanations could be revised, and that no single authority had the final word. For the first time in Greek history, inquiry itself became a way of life. 6. Under foreign rule, Lydia and Persia. This period of prosperity did not mean political independence. As Ionian cities grew wealthier, they also became harder to ignore. By the mid-500s BCE, the Lydian kingdom under Croesus had extended its power across western Anatolia, bringing Ionia into its sphere. The cities were not conquered by force. they kept their institutions and their local laws. In return, they paid tribute and aligned their foreign policy with Lydia's interests. For many Ionians, this arrangement was tolerable. Trade continued, wealth flowed, daily civic life remained familiar. But it was clear that ultimate authority now lay beyond the cities themselves. That balance collapsed in 546 BCE. When Cyrus the Great defeated Lydia, Ionia was absorbed into the Persian Empire. Persian rule was more systematic and less flexible. The cities remained physically intact, but political power shifted decisively outward. Independent governments were replaced with rulers whose position depended on Persian approval. Taxes were assessed more regularly, and military obligations were no longer negotiable. From the Ionian perspective, the change was subtle but profound. Markets still opened each morning. Festivals were still held. Ships still sailed. But the decisions that mattered most, war, alliances, leadership, were no longer made in Ionian assemblies. For communities with long traditions of self-rule and public debate, this loss cut deep. Prosperity continued, but it now came with supervision. Beneath the surface of everyday life, resentment began to build, a tension that would not remain contained for long. 7. The Ionian Revolt. In 499 BCE, the Ionian cities rose against Persian rule. The revolt began in Miletus, where local leaders turned against the Persian-backed rulers who governed the cities on behalf of the empire. For the first time in decades, the Ionians attempted to reclaim control over their own political future, rather than accept decisions imposed from outside. They were not entirely alone. Athens and Eretria sent ships in support, motivated partly by shared Greek ties and partly by their own fears of Persian expansion. Together, the rebels struck at Persian authority, marching inland and burning Sardis, the regional administrative center. The act was symbolic as much as strategic. It showed that Persian power could be challenged. For a short time, the revolt appeared to spread. Several cities joined, and Persian control along the coast weakened. But the imbalance of power was decisive. Persia regrouped and responded with overwhelming force. Over the next several years, Persian armies and fleets moved methodically along the Ionian coastline, retaking cities one by one, cutting supply lines, and isolating rebel strongholds. In 493 BCE, Miletus fell. The city was destroyed, its population deported, and its political role erased. The revolt collapsed, and with it, any realistic hope of Ionian independence. The cities themselves survived, and many soon recovered economically. But their position had changed permanently. Ionia would no longer lead the Greek world politically. At the same time, the revolt drew Athens into direct conflict with Persia, helping to trigger the Greco-Persian wars that followed, even though Ionia itself would not regain independence through them. 8. Alexander and the long afterlife of Ionia. In 334 BCE, Alexander the Great, the young king of Macedon, crossed into Anatolia at the start of his war against Persia. As he moved along the coast, Ionian cities opened their gates to him. There was little resistance. For people who had lived under Persian rule for generations, Alexander looked like a liberator, and just as importantly, like a Greek ruler. Persian control collapsed quickly. Garrisons withdrew, tribute stopped, and the visible signs of imperial authority disappeared. For the first time in a long while, Ionian cities were no longer answering to an Eastern empire. Civic life picked up again. Temples were repaired, and many people believed that real independence had finally returned. But what followed helps explain Ionia's later history. When Alexander died, his empire did not stay together. It broke apart, and Ionia became part of a much larger struggle between his successors. The names of the rulers changed, but the basic situation did not. The cities remained Greek in language and culture, but they were no longer in control of their own fate. Decisions about power, money, and security were made far away. This pattern continued under Roman rule. Ionia was no longer a political center, but it was not pushed to the margins either. Its cities were stable, wealthy, and well-connected. Places like Miletus and Ephesus became respected provincial cities, known for education and culture rather than power. Romans did not come to Ionia to learn how to rule. They came to learn how to think, speak, and write in Greek. By this stage, Ionia was no longer producing radical new philosophies. The moment when thinkers first tried to explain the world without myth was already long past. But those early ideas did not disappear. They were taught in schools, discussed in public spaces, and absorbed into Roman education. What had once been new became foundational. When you look back at the Ionians, one thing stands out. They were never a great empire. They didn't conquer large territories or dominate the Mediterranean. What made them matter was something else. Ionian cities sat in places where different worlds met. They were exposed early to trade, movement, and unfamiliar ideas. People there saw that old explanations didn't always match what they experienced. And instead of inventing new stories to protect tradition, they started asking questions. That shift stayed important long after Ionia lost its independence. The cities stopped leading armies, but they didn't stop shaping how people thought. Their ideas were taught, reused, and carried far beyond the Aegean. Later, Greeks and Romans inherited them, often without even noticing where they came from. Ionia's influence didn't come from power or conquest. It came from the habit of questioning. And that's why it's still worth paying attention to today. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something about the Ionians. If you like this video, subscribing and liking helps us continue making content like this.